I'd like to say hello to all the listeners out there. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an associate editor at Horde's Dairyman magazine. Very pleased to welcome you all to the webinar today. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Horde's Dairyman and the University of Illinois have been co-hosting these presentations since 2011. We work as a team to coordinate the webinars, and I'd like to extend a thank you to our producer, Jim Baltz at the University of Illinois, and our Horde's Dairyman online media manager, Patty Hirchin, for the work that they do behind the scenes to pull these events together. For all of you that are listening live today, we do have the handouts available for you if you would like to print out the PowerPoint slides and take any notes. If you go to the control panel that should be on your screen right now, you can look towards the bottom, and there's a section that says handouts, and right there are some links that you can click on, and that will take you directly to the PDF of the slide. So that's some special access for people who are able to join the webinar live. You have the opportunity to check out those slides in case you want them for future reference. Today, I'm fortunate to have Mike Hutchins from the University of Illinois as my co-host. And together we have the pleasure of welcoming Trevor DeVries as our presenter. Trevor has been doing some really great work at the University of Guelph, and there he's an associate professor. We're very excited that he took the time to join us today to give this presentation, which is titled Calf Rearing Affects Lifetime Eating Behavior. This month's webinar is sponsored by AAS, and that's a company who is focused on products that meet specific needs for dairy producers, including transition cow care and preventative calf measures. We're very pleased to have their support of this program today. Mike, if you would, please take it from here and introduce our speaker a little bit more and kickstart this month's webinar.
Well, very good, Abby, and it's my personal and professional pleasure to introduce a good co-worker, Dr. Trevor DeVries, located up in Canada. He currently is the Canada Research Chair in Dairy Cattle Behavior and Welfare and professor in the Department of Animal Sciences at the University of Guelph. Trevor grew up in British Columbia and received his bachelor's degree in agriculture from the University of British Columbia in 2001. Immediately went on and got his PhD degree at that same institution in 2006. After a one-year postdoc appointment, he then joined the University of Guelph in the Department of Animal Biosciences. And his research effort focuses on dairy cattle nutrition, management, behavior, and teaches a number of classes. So Trevor, thanks a million. We're excited to have you here today. And we'll turn the program over to you to tell us about, as Abby pointed out, calf rearing affects lifetime eating behavior.
Well, thank you very much, Mike and Abby, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to give this webinar today, and thanks to Horde's for the organization, as well as Advanced Agri Solutions for the sponsorship of the webinar today. And as just introduced, the topic that I'm going to speak about is calf rearing affects lifetime eating behavior. And this is largely a summary of research that my group has been involved with over the past 10 years or so, looking at some of the early life impacts of feeding, of housing and management on calf behavior, and some of the longer term implications that some of that behavior might have. One of the take-home messages or things that I want people to go away with is the idea that when it comes to feeding cattle, and this transcends all ages and classes of cattle, but specifically today's focusing on calves, is the idea that it's not only important what they eat, but also how they eat it. And that's really a point that I want to drive home, is that the behavior of the animal can have significant consequences on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve in the rearing and raising of these animals that we have on our farms. And so specifically related to calves, we know that the eating behavior patterns and overall general behavioral patterns of those calves can have immediate consequences, specifically on nutrient consumption and growth. And I'm going to provide some examples of that. throughout my presentation here this afternoon. And then what I want to do as well is really drive home the idea that these behavior patterns have the opportunity to be learned and developed early in the life of these young ruminants. And we have a lot of actually good literature, good science to tell us that young ruminants and particularly are very impressionable when it comes to the development and learning of their different behavioral repertoires. And that learning can be influenced by a variety of factors. And what I want to do is just touch on a few of those in this webinar today to show how those factors can be learned and some of the influencing factors there. And then also talk about how persistence of those things may have longer term implications. And that's one of the things that we know is that when we think about the behavior patterns, particularly of mature cattle, we know that their eating behavior affects their health and productivity. And that's another major component of my research program is focused on looking at what mature lactating cows do with the feed that we put in front of them, how they interact with it, what they consume, and look at some of those implications from a health and production standpoint. And we know, as I mentioned before, that it's not just what we throw in front of them that's going to make the difference at the end of the day. It's actually how the cow deals with that feed that we've put in front of them and the resultant digestion of that feed that they're able to consume. And I just want to give a couple examples of how that can be important for the adult animal before getting into some of the specific research that we have on calves. And so this first example is some recent data actually that we just published in the last couple of months in the Journal of Dairy Science. And this was an analysis that we did. It was a multi-study analysis where we took data from a bunch of studies that we've conducted over the last 10 years or so and tried to use that data to associate different production outcomes like the intake level of the cows, like production, with various behavioral inputs to see which behaviors were best predictive of things like dry matter intake and production. And in particular, these were all high producing cows in kind of early to peak lactation. And what we found at the end of the day in our analysis was when we tried to model something like dry matter intake, one of the things that we found was that the two most consistent behaviors associated with high dry matter intake in cows were the amount of time cows spent eating, so their feeding time per day, as well as their meal frequency, so how many times a day they're getting up and going to the feed bunk across the day. And the one example that you have here on the screen is data showing that association between the feeding time and dry matter intake level of the cows. And what you can see here is there's this positive relationship where there's an upward slope here where basically as cows spend more time at the feed bunk, it's associated with a higher level of dry matter intake. And there is a fair amount of variation around that, and you're going to have that. But specifically, I want to think about these cows at the upper end here. So our primarily our highest intake, highest production cows are the ones that are spending 4 to 5 to 6 hours per day at the feed bunk, and they need to spend that time there to maximize their intake. And we also found in this analysis, as I mentioned before, that meal frequency is very important there as well. It's not just how fast they eat the feed and how big of a meal they have. Those are important to some degree as well, but it's really how often we can get them there to try and maximize that intake. And as a result of that, maximize their production coming from that. And why that's important as well is it's not only related to the intake level of the cows, but we also know that if we can get cows to maximize their time at the bunk, we can spread out their intake, particularly in frequent meals across the day. What that results in is a more steady input of that feed into the rumen of the cows across the day, resulting in a much more stable rumen environment, which is conducive to a better digestive pattern. And so we see a lot more stability as far as fiber digestion in the rumen of the cows, a lot less risk of things like subacute ruminal acidosis, or SARA. And as a result of that, we see better digestibility, better milk fat, and in many cases as well, an improvement in overall efficiency of those cows. And so those are the kind of feeding patterns that we're looking to see in our adult cows as they consume their feed. The other aspect of eating behavior that we need to think about is not only the time course of consumption, but the other thing that we specifically look at from a research perspective and try to extend to the dairy community as much as possible is that it's not only important what they eat and how they eat it, but what they consume at the end of the day. And specifically when it comes to the amount of sorting or selection that cows do. And despite our best efforts with providing good total mixed rations, TMRs, to cows, we know that they're going to sort that diet. And one of the things that we've seen over and over is that the more sorting that a cow does, the greater deviance from kind of expectations that we see when it comes to a health and production standpoint in cows. And I just wanted to highlight with some data here what that can translate into. And this is, again, some fairly recent data from a study we did a couple of years back, published last year, where each of these figures here, each of these data points represents one cow. And in this case, in this study, all the cows were fed the same diet. And what you see here is differences in milk components based on how much sorting they're doing of these rations. And in this case, we're looking at the amount of sorting of the long particles of this shaker box here. So the top screen of the shaker box, as shown on the bottom left-hand side of the screen here. When we look at the data here, 100% on this scale means that the cows are eating exactly as we're putting in front of them those particles. And so what you see is that as we move down from 100, that basically means cows are sorting against those particles. And so if you look at this association that I have here, if we actually look from right to left, as cows select more, so as we move further away from 100, you see their milk fat percentage go down. And for many of us, that doesn't surprise us, because you think, well, cows typically sort for shorter, more palatable particles. They're sorting against fiber. That potentially can throw that rumen off. And as a result, we may see milk fat depression and lower milk fat. And that, again, is a very consistent response that we see as we see more sorting. But it's also interesting to note that we see a very similar pattern here on the bottom right side with milk protein as well, where, again, you see that same relationship. If we move from right to left, we see as they sort more against those long particles, we see milk protein go down in those cows. And so it's not just fiber consumption, it's the total balance of nutrients. If cows aren't consuming that diet as it's put in front of them, then they're not going to be maximizing, say, microbial protein output, and they have the availability of protein and particularly that good balance of amino acids that they need to, say, maximize their milk protein composition. And so, again, just examples of how the eating behavior of cows, particularly lactating cows, can have a significant impact on their health and production. And so what I want to do for the rest of the webinar this afternoon is get you to think about what factors may be influencing these eating patterns that may start early in life, and then how do they maybe persist over time, or what are things that may influence the persistence of those different behaviors over time. And so that kind of leads us into our first poll question this afternoon, which is really asking that question: is what impacts those eating patterns early on in life and their persistence? And I've given you 4 options here: the amount of milk fed, the type of solid feed consumed, the feeding method, as well as housing management. And so of those 4 options, what do you think is most important when it comes to influencing and development of those eating patterns?
Well, Trevor, we're off and running. We're very active voting going on here. I'm ready to vote. Abby, are you going to vote or not?
I will. I mean, I think they all look like very valid answers. If I had to pick one, I would pick the third one, the feeding method, What about you, Mike?
Well, I'm going to be just obstinate with you. Of course, I'm going to go housing management on a lark, but because I'm not cheating to look ahead of the PowerPoints at this point. We're pretty close, though. We're Jim. Let's go ahead and close it. We're at percentages here, and Trevor, what do you think of the answers that Jim is now sharing?
Well, I think that distribution actually probably reflects what those factors are. And so I guess maybe it was a bit of a trick question in that really all four of these factors have the potential to influence the behavior of calves early on in life, as well as the persistence of those behaviors. And so what I'm going to do then is talk about those four areas specifically to you all and give some examples of how they may influence the behavior of calves early on in life. And so we're going to start with the amount of milk that we feed to calves and think about the role that has not only from a growth and development standpoint, but also from a behavioral standpoint. And so if we think about milk feeding of calves, and I don't think this is coming as any surprise to anyone here, but we know that when that calf is born, their digestive system is really only suited to digest milk at that time period. And it takes a period of development for that calf and maturation for them to be able to adapt that system to digest solid feeds. And so that's a process that needs to occur in that calf over the early part of its life. One of the things that we know is that particularly during the first, say, 3 to 4 weeks, the first month of life, that's really critical for milk intake in these young animals, where very little to no solid feed consumption occurs. And that's pretty well regardless of the amount of milk that we're providing to those calves. And it's not till we get beyond that, those calves start to show some interest in consuming some more solid feed. And so one of the things that we've learned and we've put a lot of attention to in the last, say, 10 years when it comes to calf rearing is the idea that a calf needs access to a fairly sufficient amount of milk, probably much more than what we would have been feeding, say, 20 to 30 years ago. And what we found is that regardless of the system that we have, the housing system, the delivery system that we have, from very manual systems, as you can see in some of the pictures, to more automated type systems that are out there, we have huge opportunities within the dairy industry now to be able to get more milk to calves and see some of the results and benefits of that type of feeding practice. I just want to highlight some of the research that's been done in this area to talk about some of the benefits and the implications of that from a behavioral standpoint. And this is just an example of one study that we did a few years back, just to show you how much milk some calves are actually willing to consume. Now, what we did in this study was we compared a restricted amount of milk consumption, as you see in the red line, kind of flat line here, where they're fed all the same amount of milk, about 5 liters, just about 5 quarts of milk per day, up to the point of weaning here at about 6 weeks of age, and then wean them over a period of about 10 days, as opposed to calves that are given free access to milk or ad libitum access. And what I like people to see is the fact that these calves are capable of drinking a very large amount of milk. What you see here is these calves drinking already within 1 week of age over 8 liters of milk per day. And we've seen this in a variety of studies over the last, say, 10, 15 years or so, this idea that calves have a dramatic capability to consume much more milk than what we traditionally have provided to them. And as a result of that, and it shouldn't surprise us again, that if we get more nutrients into these animals early on in life, we're going to see dramatic differences in growth rates that are achievable from those feeding programs. And just an example, again, from that same study, where you can see in this case here that we're easily, by getting those calves drinking a lot more, getting a much higher growth rate early on in life, where they're already doubling their birth body weight well before weaning in this case, and through weaning, actually maintaining that difference in growth rate. And in the case here, we're seeing about a 20 kilo, so that's over about a 45 pound difference in body weight that's maintained right up to close to about 4 months of age in these calves as a result of that early life feeding difference. And where this results in benefits, or where we see some of the benefits of this, are both in immediate and long-term things. And again, if you followed kind of some of the literature, some of the articles, some of the presentations on this topic area over the last few years, again, this shouldn't surprise us, but we hear of a lot of positives for getting more nutrients and more growth into calves early on in life. Things like lesser indication of stress. We know calves are highly motivated to drink milk early on in life, and by providing them that output or that ability to get to milk early on in life, we're going to see an improvement there as well. Improved immune function with more nutrients, stronger ability to feed kind of the maintenance of the animal, particularly their ability to mount immune responses. We see an improvement in immune function and health of calves. There's indication that we see better feed conversion, not only early on in life, but also even past weaning in calves that have higher growth rates prior to weaning. There's with that earlier growth, we see earlier ages at first breeding, which obviously can translate into earlier age at first calving, which is again always of something of interest to producers. And then probably the biggest driver to a lot of this thought has been the idea that we can get improved lactational performance out of these animals by getting better growth out of them early on in life. And the study that I have there is the work that came out of Cornell from a few years ago, just suggesting that every kilo difference in average daily gain during the first couple months of age was related to about 1,500 kilos, or say 3,000 to 3,500 pounds more milk during their first lactation. And so these are all things that are driving our interests and desire to get more nutrients and get more growth out of calves early on in life. The other interesting thing is there, and that's something that we've looked at, is that maybe there's some potential benefits from a behavior standpoint, from an eating standpoint as well. And we've actually looked at that in one of our studies. So this same study that I just described to you, where we were looking at calves fed restricted amounts of milk, so basically twice a day, 2 meals per day. It shouldn't surprise you that, as you see in this graph, this is the amount of time that calves spend eating per day, that those calves on a restricted diet are basically having 2 meals per day. So they get their milk in the morning and again in the afternoon, and they consume it all in 2 large meals. As opposed to calves that in this case had ad libitum intake, but we see that in other systems too, where we've got calves on, say, auto feeders, where they're given the opportunity to have multiple meals across the day, is that you actually end up seeing a little bit more consistency in their intake pattern. In this case, we still see some diurnal variation where they're having kind of their largest meals in the morning and afternoon, but then you do see other periods of the day where those calves are coming and having meals of milk. And what we were particularly interested in this study was to see how that then related to their solid feed consumptions as well in those calves, and whether or not there was any kind of relay of that same kind of behavioral or intake pattern in those animals. And what we found was that, interestingly, there was this kind of correlation there, where those calves, again, if you look at the higher line here, the green line here, we see that those calves fed restricted amounts of milk actually center most of their solid feed consumption in this case now around that time of milk delivery in the morning and again in the afternoon, where they're having their largest and kind of most concentrated meals during that time period. Whereas those calves fed high levels of milk, where they had access to it throughout the day, even though they're consuming quite a bit less, which we would expect to see, they're actually having more kind of a distribution. If we look at it statistically, it's a little bit hard to see in the graph here, but over across the day, we actually see a difference in their intake patterns. And I have that on the next slide, just a summary of what we observed there in that study. And so those calves that were fed a higher level of milk consumed their solid feed at a slower rate in smaller meals. They took longer pauses while eating, and they had a bit of a lesser response to feed delivery. And what I mean by that is they had this kind of less of a slug feeding response as compared to their restricted fed counterparts. And that was really our hypothesis there, that if we're feeding calves to consume their milk very quickly, you're going to see the same kind of carryover effect in terms of their solid feed consumption. And that's really what we observed in that study, where we saw kind of a similar type response in those calves. And so that moves us on then to talking about milk onto solid feed. And again, solid feed's an interesting conversation when it comes to calves, because this is an area too where there's been a fair amount of debate over the years as far as what is optimal from a feeding perspective, and what is our best option when providing solid feed to calves early on in life. And I bring forth another poll question that I want people's opinion on to think of is, if we're feeding calves early on in life, and what I'm speaking of here is during the milk feeding phase, what should we be providing those calves from a solid feed perspective? Should it be only starter concentrate, or should it be starter and hay, starter mixed with some hay, or maybe just some free choice hay or forage for those animals? So I'd like to see your opinions on that.
Well, the polls are open, and we're often voting very briskly here. Abby, you could better jump in quick if you're going to influence the vote. Kind of like those Russians.
People are paying attention, so that's a good sign. I'm going to pick just starter if we're talking about calves early in life. That will be my vote.
And I'm going to join you as well. And let's close the polls here, Jim, because we're over 2/3 here. And Dr. DeVries, what any big surprises here? Is Abby and myself correct?
No, I don't think it's a surprise. I would say that, and again, that's what the industry has been largely pushed towards over the last, say, a few decades, is the idea that we need to get starter into calves early on in life, as it's going to influence rumen development. And so it shouldn't surprise us that we see that. However, it's interesting to note that we do have some votes for providing some level of forage to those calves as well. And that's, again, shouldn't come too much of a surprise either, as we've seen a building of research in that area as well, suggesting that there may be some benefit of getting some forage into calves early on in life. One of the things I want to do is talk about that, particularly that need for these different types of feed early on in life. And as I was just mentioning, we need, or we know that calves need to consume that solid feed, particularly as they approach the period of weaning, to really establish kind of the physical and metabolic development of the rumen. And again, we have very good research from years past, as well as newer research, to suggest why that's important from a growth and development standpoint. And the one thing that we know for sure is that starter consumption, concentrate consumption, is vitally important from early production of volatile fatty acids, which are going to contribute to the growth and development of the papillae of the rumen, particularly butyrate production, very important from a papillae growth and absorption development standpoint. However, one of the things that we can't forget is that, and again, we have good older research to suggest that the provision of some fiber or forage to those animals early on in life can also have an influence on the development, particularly of the musculature of that rumen, as well as volume of that rumen. But because of some of the competing demands basically between these feeds, there's been some disagreement over the years as far as what's optimal for those calves. And there's always this concern that if we provide calves forage too early on in life, that forage is going to fill the rumen and it's going to displace some of that concentrate intake, which we know is, again, critically important from a rumen development standpoint. Now, challenging some of that thought is a building body of literature, of research, to suggest that necessarily doesn't always have to happen. And this is just an example of one of those studies. This is a study done by some Canadian colleagues where they're looking at calves fed either just starter in the blue line here early on in life, or starter alongside some chopped grass hay. And what you see in the case of this study, as well as what we've seen in a few other studies, is that when we provide hay, particularly a chopped forage in a limited quantity, it doesn't necessarily mean that we displace some of that starter intake. And what they actually found here was that the difference between these lines is really the amount of forage consumed. And so we're not displacing starter intake necessarily by giving them access to a forage source. And what's interesting in this research is that provision of forage early on in life didn't necessarily delay rumen metabolic development either, but rather it kind of enhanced it, as indicated in this case by an increase in the amount of blood beta hydroxybutyrate, or BHB, that we see in these calves. And BHB levels in calves, particularly calves that are well nourished early on in life, is a good sign of how much butyrate is actually getting absorbed across that rumen epithelium, and is a good indicator of how much butyrate is being produced, as well as how well those kind of rumen papillae are at absorbing some of those end products of fermentation. And so what we see here is that these calves provided with forage actually seem to have a little bit better level or higher level of blood BHBA, indicating a little bit of improvement in rumen function. And that actually, in this case, in this study, as well as some other work, has shown that can translate then into improvements in feed consumption post-weaning as well. In the case of the study here, we see, again, up to about 4.5 months of age, once these animals are all on the same diet, that we see an improvement in overall dry matter intake level in these calves that previously or early on in life had access to both starter and hay in their diet. One of the points that I want to make, though, from a eating behavior standpoint, is that we need to be very careful with the type, the amount, and length of the forage. And what I mean by this is, what research has shown is that if we provide calves, particularly when we think about the type of forage, if we provide them with a very palatable, very digestible forage, something like a good quality alfalfa hay or even a highly digestible grass hay, what we see is that calves will actually then start to preferentially select for those forages. And that's not the desired response that we want. What we want is those calves consuming the bulk of their dry matter as starter, but only consuming a very small proportion of forage, just to give it a little bit enough to get that rumen working and start to build and grow using that kind of effective fiber that is sitting in that rumen. And so we have to be careful with the type. And actually what researchers have shown is that the optimal types are actually your lower quality type forages, like a cereal straw or a poorer quality grass hay, as having the most positive benefit for these animals early on in life. The amount is also important there as well. They don't need a whole lot. About 5% of total dry matter or less is really all that we need in the diet to actually have that positive impact. And then related to this as well as the length of that forage that goes in there. And I have two pictures of cereal straw here on the screen here. And you can imagine that if you've got cereal straw going into the calf's rumen that looks like this stuff that you see on the left-hand side of the screen here, that's not going to move very fast out of that rumen. It's going to sit there and it's going to collect, and it's not going to be able to pass through. And so if we're going to be providing these calves with some level of forage early on in life, we need to make sure that it's chopped fine enough down to at least an inch or less, so that that forage has a chance of being digested and moving through that calf's rumen. That being said, one of the things that I wanted to highlight just from an interest standpoint is it is the physical effectiveness of that forage that actually has an impact for those calves and can play a role in the growth and behavior of those calves. And we actually demonstrated that in a study that we did a few years back, where we were looking at, again, feeding calves a mixture of their starter concentrate with some grass hay, which we either chopped to be what we called coarse, so it was chopped down to about 1.5 inches in length, or we took that hay and we ground it, and we fed that ground hay with their concentrate. So basically losing kind of all the physical effectiveness of that concentrate. And what we found in that study, and this is a collaboration with some researchers out of Spain, was that when we looked at these calves, particularly at weaning and during the weaning process, we actually saw that those calves on the coarse diet, so that had that kind of physically effective hay in their diet, had an improvement in feed intake during the post-weaning period, an improvement in gain-to-feed ratio, as well as total tract nutrient digestibility. So suggesting that physical effectiveness of that forage was actually having a positive impact on the digestion of those animals, as opposed to just grinding it and having it purely as a fiber source in the complete feed of those animals. Beyond just the performance aspects of the calves, what was interesting actually in this study is that we actually induced a behavioral response or difference when it came to the diet selection or sorting behavior of these calves. And so what we did in this study was, after the calves had been weaned and were finished with their treatment diets, we actually put them all onto a mixed diet and then looked at how those calves sorted that diet after that weaning process. And what we found was that when we looked at sorting from basically two perspectives, how much sorting they're doing of the NDF, so the neutral detergent fiber representing the forage component of the diet, or the NFC, so the non-fiber carbohydrate component, so the concentrate component of the diet, what we found is that if we look at those calves previously offered the diet with the chopped hay or physically effective kind of chopped hay in their ration, what we saw is really no difference from 100% here. So those calves were not sorting that diet at all, and so eating the diet as it's put in front of them. Contrary to that, what we saw was that those calves previously offered the mixed ration with ground hay, so the diet with really no physical effective hay in it. When they were later transitioned to this diet that had some coarser hay in the mix, what we found is that those animals sorted against the fiber, so against that hay, and sorted for the concentrate. So they were actually developing what we would describe as a sorting pattern, which again is not desirable, where these animals are selecting against fiber and for the higher digestible, higher energy concentrate components of their ration. So another indicator of how we can influence potentially longer term behavioral patterns by some of these early life feeding practices. So kind of summing that up, I just threw this up here because I wanted to recommend some of my best practices when it comes to feeding calves early on in life from a solid feed perspective. And first and foremost, we want to ensure calves have access to a quality starter concentrate. So good quality, high protein, very palatable ingredients overall feed is very important for stimulating good intake and good rumen development. But at the same time, what the research suggests is that providing a forage source early in life can also have some positive impacts. As I mentioned before, a grass, hay, or cereal straw, chopped fine and limited to about 5% of the total dry matter intake of the calves, particularly mixed in with the grain of the calves, as you can maybe see in the picture here, can have a very positive impact when it comes to intake and behavioral development in these calves early on in life. Another thing that I wanted to touch on was how we feed heifers after weaning. And one of the reasons I bring this up is we have a challenge, particularly often in ensuring good intake and consistency in what heifers consume after they've been weaned off of milk and onto solid feed. And a lot of the times that challenge in consistency in consumption relates to how we feed these animals. And it doesn't surprise me anymore when I walk onto dairy farms and I see sites like this, because it's very common when we walk onto farms, particularly when we look at those post-weaning pens, animals at that kind of 2 to 4 months of age kind of range, that we see feeding situations like you see on the screen here, where people are providing some level of concentrate to the animals, and then usually coupling that with some access to some forage source, often kind of free access forage source to those animals. And the challenge that we have with this type of feeding practice, particularly in that early post-weaning period, is we don't really have any control over what those animals are consuming within the day, across the day, and between animals, say, within a pen. And it becomes very difficult for us to really get a good grasp of how much individual animals are consuming and how consistent that is. In addition to that, we also know that this type of feeding practice can also have a fairly significant impact on their eating patterns. And just as an example of that, we did a study. Again, this is going back about 10 years. In some of my early work post graduation, where I was looking at how simply providing calves, early post-weaning calves, their concentrate separate from their forage source can have on their intake patterns. And what you see here in this figure is the amount of dry matter intake per hour averaged over a 24-hour period. And what you see is the concentrate intake in these calves mapping out very well to when that feed gets delivered in the morning, where they basically consume most of their concentrate in one large meal and then slowly pick at their forage, in this case a grass hay, for the rest of the day. And this type of slug feeding response that we see is quite common when you look at these animals early in that post-weaning period. And one of the things that we were interested in determining is whether or not that could have a longer-term impact on their feeding behavior patterns. And so we did this in a follow-up study where we looked at how feeding calves either a mixed ration, so a TMR in the red line here, or a top dress type ration where we threw their concentrate on top of their forage source, had on their eating patterns. And so what you see in the graph here is basically a similar type graph, except in this case, the percentage of heifers at the feed bunk over the across the day. What you see is that at the time of feed delivery, which is around noon in this trial, we see a large spike in feeding activity and a larger spike for those animals fed the top dressed ration, corresponding again to that slug feeding response where they're going up to the bunk and they're consuming all that concentrate that's readily available to them at that time period. And what we were interested in the study is whether or not that could have a carryover effect on their kind of long-term eating patterns. And so what we did was that after about 3.5 months, we moved those animals onto a common TMR. And so that we mixed them or moved them onto a common novel TMR that was totally unfamiliar. And when I switch the slide, you'll see that the pattern doesn't change much. So this is when they're on their treatment diets. And then as I switch the screen here, this is when they're on the same TMR after. And so this is quite dramatic in that those animals, even though they're on the exact same diet, same feeding program during this time period, they actually demonstrate a difference in their overall diurnal feeding pattern, where you see still this retained larger response to the delivery of feed early on after feed delivery here in the middle of the day. So again, those animals show this kind of slug feeding response, even though there's really no behavioral cue or management cue for them to do that or have that response to their feed. And what we saw is that this actually persisted across the next 2 months that we followed these animals. And so what that showed us is that we had a real influence on kind of the learning of these feeding patterns and the persistence of those feeding patterns early on in life in these animals. And so again, kind of a quick take home here when it comes to feeding these animals in that early post-weaning period. Just wanted to highlight the idea that if we're going to promote consistency in intake and time and composition, as well as good eating patterns that again are going to persist over times, we want to make sure that the diets we're getting to these animals are as consistent as possible. And so providing mixed diets, dry TMR, even in that early post-weaning period, can go a long ways as far as promoting that consistency in intake, as well as those good eating patterns. We're going to switch gears a little bit for the rest of the presentation here and move on from how we feed calves and what we feed calves to some more housing management related things as it pertains to calf management. And I asked the question on the screen, what else promotes better eating patterns in calves? And one of the things that we've learned is that a social feeding environment, or as it says on the screen, eating with a friend, can actually have a positive impact on the eating patterns of cows. And it might sound quite funny, but this is something that we've learned over the last, again, 10 years or so with more and more research in this area, that when we provide calves with a social feeding environment or social grouping environment, we see positive impacts on those animals. And there's been lots of good research, as summarized in actually the review paper that I've referenced here on the screen, to suggest that grouping calves early on in life can have very positive impacts on a number of different things, particularly on consumption of solid food, and then resultant impacts on growth, particularly around the weaning period and early post-weaning period. And what that research shows is that there seems to be a social facilitation, so a behavioral impact of animals being together, which then can promote greater interest in consuming, say, new feeds, getting to feed sources, and increasing their solid feed consumption, particularly at a time period in life where it's dramatically or critically important for them to do that. And just one example of that, this is one of our studies where we looked at this, and this was a very simple study just comparing calves that are individually housed, so in their individual hutch, or in kind of a double wide hutch where we had them pair housed. We had two calves together right from birth up to the point of weaning. And what you see in the case of the study is that if we look at the intake level of the calf, so this is dry matter intake, solid feed consumption over the first period of life up to the point of weaning here, where it started just past 6 weeks of life and they're weaned at about 8 weeks of life. What we see is that those calves that are pair housed, they start to consume just a little bit of solid feed a little earlier than their individually housed comparators, and show a larger or greater amount of solid feed consumption during that weaning period. And that's really where we see a lot of the benefit in the case of the research when it comes to housing of calves early on in life, and some of the impacts that it has on the intake levels of those calves. And what we saw in the case of this study, and as shown here, and this is now the body weight of these calves, I've shown it here in kilos, but showing you the growth rates here in pounds per day over that weaning period, where the real benefit that we see here is that these calves that are pair housed are showing a much higher growth rate. So they're able to maintain a growth rate of about 1.5 pounds per day over that weaning period, as opposed to those calves that were individually housed that only experienced a growth rate of just under a pound per day over that time period, and showing a little bit less of a growth check than those individually housed calves. And that's important for us to really consider, because any kind of insult to the growth rate or ability of those animals to meet maintenance and meet growth during this time period is critically important for how they're going to perform post-weaning. So if those calves who are going to be stressed by the fact that they're getting weaned, they're moving on to different types of feeds, they're maybe moving into new novel environments, if they're also at that time challenged from a nutrient intake standpoint, that's going to increase their risk of succumbing to some of these issues that we see in calves that are highly prevalent in that early post-weaning period. And so if we can maintain better growth during that time period, they're going to be much better off. And one of the things that we noted in the case of this study is that those calves also developed healthier eating patterns. And so this is another good example of where these calves, during their milk feeding phase, week 6 of life, are showing differences in their eating patterns. And this is the number of meals that these calves are having per day. So meal frequency, we see a difference where those pair house calves are having more frequent meals. And going back to my earlier part of my presentation, if you were on with us then, you would have heard the idea that when it comes to adult dairy cattle, that's a pattern that we want to see from an intake and from a healthy rumen perspective. And what we saw in these calves is that as they transitioned post-weaning into a housing system where they were group housed, what we saw is the persistence of those eating patterns. So in week 9 and week 12 of life, post-weaning, when they're all at this point pair housed and eating in the exact same kind of manner, we see actually the persistence of those difference in eating patterns. So those calves that were previously pair housed still displaying those better eating patterns as compared to their individually housed comparators. And the last thing I want to touch on is the fact that similar to cows, when it comes to feeding calves, one of the things that we've learned is that they also want to be able to feed at the same time. And we know that in lactating cows, eating behavior can be dramatically influenced by, say, the amount of available bunk space and the ability of those animals to get to feed when they want to. And one of the things that we've learned is that calves can actually have similar kind of, or show similar impacts of reduced feed availability. And again, we've shown this in a study that we did a few years back, where we took calves early on in life and we basically forced them in pairs to either compete for feed access, so where they basically had one milk access point and one solid feed access point, so one bucket per 2 calves, or provide them with unrestricted access to their feed, so they had 2 buckets or 2 teats available for milk and 2 buckets available for solid feed. And what you see in just this case here as an example is the amount of solid feed consumed over the pre-weaning type period. And what you see is an increase in total dry matter consumption of those calves that did not have to compete for access to their feed, suggesting that, again, that restricting or providing some competition potentially has negative impacts on those calves' ability to maximize their intake, which, again, is going to be difficult from a rumen development and weaning standpoint. The last point I want to make, though, here is that similar to what I've showed before, these behavior patterns that actually developed during that time period persisted through and post-weaning. And so following up on these calves in the weeks following weaning, where all calves had unrestricted access to feed and they didn't have to face any competition for feed access, what we see is differences in these behavior patterns that have been learned in these calves. So calves that had previously had to compete for access during the milk feeding phase and no longer having to post-weaning, still displaying greater amounts of displacements, so fighting for feed access, even though they don't need to during this time period, they're still engaged in that type of behavior. As a result of that, having less synchronized meals, so feeding less at the same time as other animals, so choosing to avoid feeding at the same time as other animals. And then finally, showing higher rates of intake as well, because again, they've learned that as part of kind of that competitive feeding response is that they need to eat quickly. And again, these are, as I argued early in the presentation, all kind of behavioral patterns that we'd really like to avoid as that animal matures and develops. And so anything that we can do to prevent those from happening early on in life are going to be important for us to think about. And so that gets me to the end of my presentation here with a few quick take-home messages. Number one, I hope that I've impressed upon you the idea that the feeding behavior of calves may have both immediate and long-term impacts. And if we're going to then think about ways of ensuring good growth and a lifetime of healthy eating patterns in these animals, there's a few things we need to consider. Number one, making sure we have sufficient milk in front of those animals so that they can maximize their growth early on in life, making sure they eat a quality starter, but also consider the role of physically effective forage when it comes to the solid feeding of those animals. Think about group housing animals where possible, and we see the benefits of that. But then in those situations, also realize that we need to limit competition for feed access, as that potentially also can have a negative impact on their feeding behavior patterns and the development of those patterns. So with that, brings me to the end. I'd like to thank once again Hordes and Advanced Agri Solutions for sponsorship of this webinar. Thank you to various research sponsors who who contributed to much of the research described here in this webinar, and hopefully can answer a few questions for you.
Very good, Trevor. I'll turn the program back to Abby to wind up a little bit before we go to the Q&A.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Trevor, for a great presentation. I think you brought up some points that might challenge the way that we've thought that we should raise calves, but there might be some things that we could adapt to really better that animal for the long term. So thank you for sharing some of that research with us today. Also, we really appreciate the support of AAS for sponsoring this particular webinar. I'm really glad to have them on board with this. For all of you that are out there listening, if you would like to listen to this presentation again or share it with someone else, I just want to let you know that it will be archived on our website. This webinar and all of our past webinars over the last couple of years are available at hordes.com/webinars. So feel free to take a look there and visit any of the webinars that we have done since we began this series, including the one today. Also, you will all be receiving a survey in the mail in your email box, and that will give us ideas for future presentations and let us know if there's anything we can do differently to make this a better experience for you. So please fill that out because it really does help us shape our future webinars. Hope that you all will make plans to attend our future presentations, which are coming up the next couple of months. In June, we have a presentation titled Supervised Hoof Health with a No Lameness Tolerance Policy, and that will be presented by Carl Berge of the Dairyland Hoof Care Institute, and that presentation will be sponsored by Zinpro. Then looking farther ahead, we have our July presentation, which will focus on reduced lignin alfalfa, presented by Ev Thomas of Oak Point Consulting. So 2 different topics coming up. We hope that people that are listening today will join us for those presentations. I know that a few questions have come in on the GoToWebinar panel. So Mike, if you want to lead Trevor through that process, that would be great.
Well, very good. As many of your listeners know, Abby, they can send questions ahead. So we have 2 of them, Trevor. And here's the first one. And I think you can read it perhaps faster than I can talk it in terms of weaning at 7 weeks of age and their feeding programs. How much milk a calf can take on and a better weaning process. We also pair calves. We see lots of sucking. Any comments on this question?
Yeah, definitely. It's a very good question. I guess there's a number of different things here to think about and consider. As far as the amount goes, looks like they're giving 3 quarts twice a day, going up to 5 quarts twice a day, up to 10 quarts. It's a lot of milk, and we're seeing a lot of success with kind of going to those feeding levels out there in the industry from a growth perspective and a health perspective. How much can they take on? I assume the question's about on a per meal basis. Now, again, there has been some concern about this, and my recommendation is that if we can go to a 3rd feeding and split that over 3 feedings per day, that's probably going to be of benefit to those calves. However, if we're limited to twice a day feeding, 5 quarts per feeding is not necessarily a bad thing, and the added milk is actually a benefit for those animals. Now, I think one of the challenges that they might be facing here is actually the age at which they're starting the weaning process. Starting to wean at 5 weeks of age may be a little early when it comes to this kind of feeding level, where a lot of research we've done and others has shown that particularly when calves fed kind of, let's say higher levels, let's say 8 liters or 8 quarts per day or more, their propensity to start eating solid feed really doesn't start till about 6 weeks of age. And so we're probably better off waiting to start weaning those calves at about 6 weeks and maybe push them forward by 1 week at least to try get them a little bit more established onto solid feed before we get them fully weaned off, and hopefully around 8 weeks of age or so to see that happening. I think the challenge from the cross-sucking standpoint has to do again with the fact that you're introducing or pairing those calves around that time of weaning. And so that can be a challenge where if you're introducing those calves to other calves right at the point where their milk is getting reduced, those calves are showing a fairly high sucking motivation at that time point, and you're going to see an increased risk of that cross-sucking. And so my recommendation there is, and again, to be consistent, what we've seen is that a lot of the benefits of pair housing or group housing is seen the earlier we can do it. So my recommendation would be to try get those calves paired earlier than what you're currently doing, if possible. A lot of the researchers suggest within the first couple of weeks of life, actually, to see some of the best or most long-term benefits of that. If that's not possible, what I would recommend then is avoiding that pairing occurring right at that weaning point, because that's probably your biggest risk factor for that sucking that you're seeing at that time period.
Here's another question that came in from one of our earlier participants, and that is, what is the balance between the amount of milk or milk replacer and the amount of calf starter being fed before weaning? Any guidelines or principles that you would recommend?
Well, I guess this is, again, a fairly broad question. My quick answer to that would be try to get as much milk as possible into those animals, particularly in the first 4 to 6 weeks of life. And then at that point, around week 6 of life, is to transition them off. And so start to bring them down on a gradual weaning program, whether that's manually or automated, doesn't matter. We want to bring them down slowly over at least a period of about 2 weeks of time so that we can get them weaned off and onto solid feed. And if we do that, if we stretch them out over, say, a 2-week weaning period, and we do that gradually, there's no reason why we can't have those calves, say, consuming at least a kilo, so like 2.2 to 2.5 pounds of solid feed by the time that we have those calves weaned, if not more, anywhere up to, say, let's say 3 to 4 pounds of solid feed consumption around that time period. And so for me, it's about getting the nutrients from milk into them as much as possible, as early as possible, and then getting a slow, gradual wean onto solid feed.
Oh, very good. Trevor, we realize you have a flight you have to catch, and we probably have 15 questions here. And so I guess what we're going to suggest is get these questions to you and let you answer them electronically, because we have email access here as well, or one of us will answer those questions at this point. And so I think we will now turn the program back to Abby to wind up today's webinar.
Thank you, Mike. And yes, thank you for the people in the audience that have submitted questions. We really do appreciate that. And we will work on getting those answers to you when Trevor has a little time to respond to them. Once again, I'd like to thank AAS for their sponsorship of this webinar. Their website is listed on the slide if you'd like to learn more about them and the products they provide. And we certainly appreciate them coming on board and supporting our webinar this month. We would also like to thank you all for listening. A very important part of this is having a great audience, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us to listen to this presentation by Trevor DeVries from the University of Guelph. As a reminder, we will be getting together again next month, same second Monday of the month, June 11th, to talk about lameness and hoof care plans by Carl Berge from Dairyman Hoof Care. So we hope that you will plan to join us on June 11th at noon Central Time for our next webinar. And until then, I'll say goodbye from all of us here at Hoard's Dairyman and the University of Illinois. As always, we appreciate your participation and hope to have you on board for a future webinar. So goodbye, take care, everyone.